Protect your DNA. BioPQQ can promote formation of new mitochondria. Infowarsstore.com.
Of course, our top story today is the tragedy in Dallas at the Black Lives Matter protest. As the protest was ending, at least one, perhaps more snipers. That's one of the most interesting things about this. We were told that it was initially a triangulated shooting. That's the way the Dallas police report it. Now that they have killed an individual, they're saying he was the lone shooter. Isn't it interesting? It's always a lone shooter. Nevertheless, at this time, the tally stands as 5 police officers dead, 7 wounded, 2 bystanders wounded. You don't hear too much about that, actually. It's being all blamed right now on a former corporal, Micah Xavier Johnson. And now we've seen copycat shootings happening across the country. We've seen in Tennessee that a shooter targeted white victims. Now, these people that were shot, let me read you who they were. This is a newspaper carrier. Jennifer Rooney was killed. She was shot while she was driving her vehicle, delivering newspapers perhaps, or maybe she was off of work. She was killed. Deborah Watts, in serious but stable condition, shot while working at a Days Inn. Another person received minor injuries at the scene after being injured by flying glass resulting from gunfire. And Officer Matthew Cousins sustained a superficial wound to the leg. I think he was the one who stopped the shooter. But understand, these people, none of them, not even the police officer who was here, had anything at all to do with these shootings in question that the protests were about. This is in Tennessee. So this is the climate that we have here. And in order to understand this climate, you need to understand the mindset that is being sold to people by our political establishment, as we're going to get to here in a moment, our educational establishment. Because that's really where this began, I believe. Goes back to Obama's mentor, Bill Ayers, and the educational establishment. That's where they invented white privilege. Now, as we look at this, just understand that if there's a hate crime, there's hatred on the right, it is the fault of the person on the right, we're told. But if there's hatred and violence from somebody on the left, guess who caused it? Somebody on the right. See, it's always people on the right who are to blame, okay? It's never the left who is to blame. They can never generate the hatred on their own, or so we're told. And of course, if it's a black person that does this, it's still the fault of a white person somewhere. Now, Jesse Jackson is a perfect example of this. He's blaming Trump for this. This is Jesse Jackson speaking in the aftermath of the coordinated attack on 11 police in Dallas. He called on President Obama to hold a conference on violence and racial disparities. Keep drumming up the racism here, he says. And this is an interview that he did in London. He said, it's kind of an anti-black mood, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim bashing, immigrant bashing, female bashing, a kind of mean-spirited division in the country. There you go. It's all Trump's fault. And quite frankly, I don't understand where they get this, because he's been talking about immigration, and black people are not immigrating into this country. We're talking about other issues. It's probably the one area that we're not getting a lot of immigration from, okay? But then, of course, we have Barack Obama and Attorney General Lynch joining in and encouraging Black Lives Matter to keep this up. Attorney General Lynch said members of Black Lives Matter movement need to keep letting their voices be heard. And Obama, while he blames guns and gun owners and says this is another reason we have to have gun control, he goes on to say that when people say Black Lives Matter, it doesn't mean that blue lives don't matter. Well, he ought to look at social media, because there's been a lot of Twitter wars and Facebook wars over that very issue. No, they don't like the fact that you use a All Lives Matter hashtag. This is about creating tribalism and racial division. And he comes out and says just the opposite. He says, right now, the data shows black folks are more vulnerable to these kinds of incidents. There's a particular burden that is being placed on a group of our fellow citizens. So he blames it on firearms, and he blames it again on division. And yet, we hear from the black police chief in Dallas that the shooting suspect wanted to kill white people and police officers, preferably white police officers, and that's what he did. As a matter of fact, he expressed his anger about Black Lives Matter, and that's what he said. He wanted to target people on a racial basis. We have another black law enforcement officer, David Clark, Milwaukee County Sheriff, coming out and saying, well, you know, quite frankly, it's coming from Obama. It's not coming from Trump. He says he didn't cause this, but you know what? He sort of fuels this anger, that misplaced anger, about things going on that were thousands of miles away. And again, Obama and Loretta Lynch still fuel that anger in what they're doing. And you have to look at this and say, are we going to allow them to focus us on the guns or on the immediate issues here? Can we understand the long-term strategy these people have been laying out for a very long time? This is something, as I mentioned before, this is a race war. And it's a race war that's been planned and developed for a long time, along with many other aspects. One of the aspects of this is to militarize the police. It is a problem and then a solution. Once they militarize the police, then they create a problem. They tell them to shoot first. Once they shoot, empty the gun, and whoever you're shooting at. That is a radical change from the way the police operated just 20 years ago, maybe even just 15 years ago, pre-9/11. That is a radical change. It's coming from the federal government. As this creates problems, what do? They step up the militarization, and they call for more control of the police at the federal level, and yet that is the very problem. That's one aspect of it. But the other direction in which they come at us is with education. You have to understand that they sell you a false dichotomy, a political map that gives us these bipolar extremes, okay? They tell you everything's going to be divided, left, right, Democrat, Republican, red and blue, or people of color and white people, okay? How simple is that? Can you make it any simpler, any more simple-minded? You know, they also give you the dichotomy of everything is either fascism or communism if they're coming at us. Look, understand that Hitler and Stalin were one and the same. They were authoritarian dictators. They were totalitarian regimes that ruled by brutality and mass murder. It's what we call democide. If you have it on a proper political spectrum, like the Nolan chart, you can see that they both wind up in the same place, and they both call themselves socialists. So it doesn't matter what your justification is, whether it's nationalism or whether it is internationalism. They want to enact authoritarianism, and that is what socialism leads us to. Where this came from, if you want to know the roots of this and where this is immediately descended from, look at Bill Ayers, someone who began as I guess we could call him a failed terrorist, somebody who came and the very embodiment of white privilege. This guy had a father who was a CEO of Con Ed, very wealthy individual, and yet he became a very well-known terrorist with the Weather Underground. It was interesting, last October when they were changing the Department of Education head, he said, I'm available officially to be the next Secretary of Education. Now, he tweeted that out as a joke on Twitter. But you know, it's interesting that the person who was leaving at that point, an individual named Duncan, who left in December, was previously CEO of the Chicago Public Schools. And that's where all of this stuff is coming from, quite frankly. When we look at the history of the Weather Underground, the fact they bombed banks, they bombed the Pentagon, with other people, interestingly enough, with the Black Panthers, they tried to do a truck heist of $1.6 million. That failed. It resulted in the murder of a Brinks guard and 2 police officers. And then from 1970 to 73, Ayers' wife, Bernadine Dornan, expressed support for Charles Manson and his followers. Why? Because they killed pigs, because they killed cops. Are you starting to see a pattern here? You're going to see more of a pattern here. Ayers ultimately got off because the FBI did some illegal snooping. But of course, nobody gets off for that anymore. Hillary Clinton gets off no matter what she does, but the rest of us don't get off because of illegal snooping, because they're illegally snooping on all of us. We would all be immune from all prosecution, would have diplomatic immunity. But he beat the rap. The ultimate white privilege. Here's a guy who comes from a really wealthy background. He engages in all this terrorism, and then he walks. And not only does he walk, but he gets a PhD, and he goes in to do something that is really dangerous, to change our educational system. I want to go back to some quotes from a 1970 book called Weathermen. This is by Harold Jacobs. Now, he was very supportive of the Weather Underground and their means. And here's some of the things that he said, and see if this doesn't sound like our white privilege social justice warriors that are being brainwashed in our universities today. He says that at the time, they warned against a one-sided response to what Weatherman refers to as white skin privilege. That was their original term. That was the term from which we get white privilege. They called it white skin privilege. He said he refuses to succumb to the despair implicit in the Weatherman's belief that the majority of whites in this country might be too racist, too defeated, too self-indulgent to make a revolution for themselves. Sound familiar? That's what we hear from the university students. Going on with this, they tied themselves closely to the Black liberation movement. They felt it was the most important element of the whole process. So as part of the third world opposition, it could eventually bring down the imperial system. The role of white radicals is primarily, although importantly, supportive and extensive. See the technique that they're using here? Focusing on black people, ginning up the anger, using them to start a war, and using the white radicals to push that. And of course, you have to make them radical by selling them the idea of white skin privilege. This all originated with Bill Ayers and the Weathermen. Strategically, they say, work should concentrate on building citywide movements that are based on intensive youth organizing across a whole range of issues. That's your community organizer network. That's how they put this together. And so we're seeing the results of this. One more quote here. This is from his wife, Bill Ayers' wife, Bernadine Dorn. She said, white youth must choose sides now. They must either fight on the side of the oppressed or be on the side of the oppressor. You can't just be a bystander. You can't just be an innocent individual. No, you are a guilty oppressor if you don't join with Black Lives Matter. We've heard this all before. Why do you think they're pushing so hard for universal free college education? It's because their program of indoctrination. That's what the colleges have become. They're not so much education anymore, okay, especially if you don't major in something technical. If you go for a liberal arts education or some of these other degrees that don't qualify you for any job other than working for the federal government, they are going to indoctrinate you into the worldview of Bill Ayers. How did he get to this point where he was so successful? Take a look at an article that's back in December of 2013. This is from Breitbart, and they talk about the educational connections and the Common Core roots that go back to Bill Ayers. And they point out that Barack Obama didn't simply embrace a concept that others had developed. Instead, the very roots of Common Core are in the early ideas generated by Obama and his fellow radical community organizer, Bill Ayers. And they point out something that as he was running for president, Stanley Kurtz pointed out that Obama's, quote, most important executive experience was to head up the Chicago Annenberg Challenge, the CAC. He said it was an education foundation that was the invention of Bill Ayers, who, of course, founded the Weather Underground in the 1960s. Now, Obama was the executive in charge of it from 1995 to 1999. He remained on the board until 2001, and the foundation funneled more than $100 million into community organizations and radical education activists. The CAC's stated purpose was to improve Chicago's public schools. Now, as chairman, Obama handled the fiscal matters, but Bill Ayers co-chaired the CAC's other key entity, the Collaborative, and there he influenced education policy. You see, if you want to destroy society, you don't blow up buildings. You don't shoot the police. What you do is you go into the educational establishment and you foment these ideas for a generation. And then you start a mass movement of people who will do those very things for you. Okay, that's ultimately where they're going, and that's where we're starting to see this now. Where did this come from? It was a long-term plan by these 1960s radicals who got smart, who went into education. Because if you can get people's minds at an early age, everybody has always understood this. Every dictator has understood this. That's why Hitler had the Hitler Youth. It's why Plato, going back to ancient Greece when he's talking about his republic, that's why he wanted to destroy the family. He wanted promiscuity so that nobody would know who their mothers and fathers were. He wanted to have the state raise the child only being loyal to the state. Get them at an early age, and they're yours for the rest of their life, especially if you can carry them all the way into college and indoctrinate them. Now, he goes on to say in this article here, implementing Ayers' radical philosophy in schools required them to associate with external partners, people that we've heard of before, like Acorn, okay? Heard of Acorn before, right? The CAC, as it was closing down, they created another pilot program called the GROW Network that was starting up in New York. Acorn, GROW Network, the connection in New York as well as in Chicago, and quite frankly, the guy who did get the job as the new chair of the Department of Education was from New York. It's New York, Chicago, the liberals who control those areas, the community organizers, the communist organizers, quite frankly. Now, this is founded by David Coleman, who is known as the architect of Common Core standards. Here's the connection. Common Core. They do not want Johnny to read or write. They want Johnny to hate. They want to fill you with nothing but contempt and tribalism and not have the means of production. They don't want you focused on creating things, on creating jobs, on creating widgets. They want to create strife and division and take this down. So they created this Grow Network in New York. Out of that came Common Core. That is where we are today, folks. When we come back, we're going to talk about Hillary Clinton. She actually spoke today because she had the cover of the Dallas tragedy. We're going to talk about the timing of all this. We're going to talk about the response and the fallout with Hillary Clinton, because we're not going to let her get away with using this as cover. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
People desperate for staples like milk, rice, and flour stormed a supermarket warehouse in Guyana City.
If you go back to 2007, the British Ministry of Defense came out and echoed a Department of Defense report saying that they believe there would be massive multi-100% food price increases worldwide, and that during that global meltdown that there would be incredible social unrest that would depopulate much of the earth. Now, Vice magazine and other publications are reporting on a 2015 report produced by the U.S. government, the UN. Cut. Let's stop it right there. I shot that video, that special, about a week and a half ago, before Hillary Clinton was basically given free rein in the United States of America to break any law she wants. Before more news came out of food riots intensifying in Asia, Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, you name it. Before we got more news of NATO plans to encircle Russia with more troops. Bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, the world financial economy is melting down by design. Everything the globalists are doing is about making us dependent on them. That's why, declaring personal independence, I am announcing that we're extending the record sales of 20 to 40% off on water filters and X2 Survival Shield, and of course, the survival food. I'm extending the 20 to 40% off for one more week, and then that's it. But I'm expanding it when it comes to non-GMO heirloom seeds, all sorts of systems to jump your car or to give yourself power during emergencies, and on solar panel systems, and on shortwave radios that are solar powered and crank powered. So we're going from a few dozen items that are discounted to more than 100 right now at InfoWarsStore.com. And we're running it right through to the beginning of next week. It is the biggest sale ever on preparedness and survival systems, because the globalists want us totally dependent on them. We need to be independent ourselves, or at least start that journey. But there's another aspect of this that makes it an absolute no-brainer. When you get the high-quality non-GMO seeds, open pollinated heirloom, when you get high quality water filtration systems massively discounted, or nutraceuticals, when you get high quality storable foods, you're not just making yourself more independent, you're also funding Infowars, that is just breaking international news every day and really giving the globalists a major run for their money. So you don't just get great prices. You don't just support the InfoWar. You support yourself and your family at the same time. It's an absolute no-brainer. I want to thank all of you that have come to InfoWarsStore.com and who have supported what we're doing. And I want to encourage those of you that haven't, check it out today. It's a total 360 win at InfoWarsStore.com.